Picture this. It's late. The air outside is cold enough to sting your lungs. Somewhere beyond the last house, beyond the last streetlight, the land turns dark and open. Fields, hedgerows, stone walls, and an old road that seems to remember every footstep that ever crossed it. Then you hear it. Not a song, not an animal call you can name, not a shout you can answer. A long, rising cry that sounds like grief itself, like someone mourning so hard their voice breaks into the wind. And the most frightening part isn't how loud it is. It's how personal it feels, as if it's meant for one door, one family, one name. That sound, whether you believe it's real or not, sits at the center of one of Ireland's most famous and misunderstood legends, the Banshee. Today we're not doing a cheap jump scare version of the story. We're going deeper into the origins, the meaning, and the cultural roots behind the Banshee in Irish folklore. Where did the legend come from? Why is she tied to certain families? Why does her cry matter more than her appearance? And how did a figure of mourning turn into a horror monster in modern pop culture? If you're into Irish myths, Celtic folklore, or the strange stories that hover between history and the supernatural, you're in the right place. And if you've ever wondered why people still talk about banshees like they're more than just a scary bedtime tale, listen closely. Because the banshee isn't just a ghost story, she's a message. In Irish tradition, the banshee is most often described as a female spirit, an otherworldly presence linked to death, yes, but not in the way most people assume. In the most traditional stories, the banshee does not kill anyone. She doesn't hunt victims. She doesn't take lives. She warns. Her role is closer to a messenger, an omen, a mourner who arrives before death like a shadow that runs ahead of the sun. People hear her keening, her wailing lament, and they understand what it means. Someone is about to die, usually in a household or a family connected to that particular banshee. And already, that should change the way you imagine her. Because the banshee at her core is not a monster in the way modern horror likes to paint her. She's something older, more symbolic, more tied to community and memory and grief. The word itself points to that older world. Banshee comes from the Irish phrase often written as bean sea or bean sídhe, usually translated as woman of the sea or woman of the fairy mound. The sea, sometimes spelled sídhe, refers to the mounds and hills believed to be entrances to the otherworld in Irish myth, places where the fairy folk, the AOC, were said to dwell. So when you say banshee, you're not just naming a spooky creature, you're touching a whole world view. In Ireland, where the land itself had thresholds, where hills weren't just hills, and where the boundary between this world and another was thinner than people like to admit. Quick pause. If you enjoy deep dive folklore documentaries like this, subscribe now. It helps the channel a lot, and it tells YouTube you want more stories like this. Irish myths, Celtic legends, and the hidden history behind famous supernatural tales. Now let's keep going. To understand the banshee, you have to understand what Irish folklore is really doing. Folklore isn't just entertainment, it's a kind of community memory. It's how people explain fear, loss, and the unexplainable. It's how they carry warnings forward without writing them down. And in Ireland, especially in older rural settings, oral tradition was powerful. Stories were told and retold, shaped by the listener, shaped by the place, shaped by the moment. That matters, because the banshee is not one single fixed character. She changes from story to story. Sometimes she appears young, sometimes old, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, sometimes silent until the moment she cries. Sometimes seen, often only heard. But in many stories, the one detail that remains almost unshakable is the sound. The keening. This is where the banshee stops being a generic ghost woman and becomes something deeply Irish. Keening was a real cultural practice in Ireland and other parts of Gaelic tradition, a vocal lament for the dead. It wasn't simply crying, it was a structured, emotional, sometimes poetic outpouring of grief, part mourning, part ritual. In some settings, women were especially associated with lamenting and mourning songs, and in older accounts, there were even professional keeners, women known for leading mourning rituals with voice and rhythm and heartbreak. Think about what that means. In a community, when death happens, grief needs a voice. It needs a sound that tells everyone, something has changed, someone is gone, the world is different now. Now take that ritual sound and imagine it echoing beyond the human world. becoming something supernatural. A grief so ancient it no longer needs a body, no longer needs a funeral to start. A lament that arrives before the death, as if the otherworld is already mourning while the living are still unaware. That idea is chilling, but it's also strangely human, because the Banshee legend may be doing something important, giving shape to the fear of sudden loss, turning the invisible approach of death into something you can hear, something you can name. So where does she come from, historically and mythically? The hard truth is that folklore rarely has a single birth date. There isn't one moment where someone invented the Banshee. The Banshee is a weaving together of older threads, beliefs about the otherworld, traditions of mourning, and a worldview where spirits and omens were part of the landscape. In Irish myth, you often find powerful female figures connected to fate, sovereignty, and prophecy. You find spirits at thresholds, by rivers, near mounds, along roads at night. You find otherworldly women who warn, who test, who mourn, who guide. The Banshee fits into that wider pattern. In many ways, she feels like a folklore bridge between two worlds, between the living and the dead, between the household and the wild, between the familiar and the unknowable. And that household part is key. Because one of the most famous and most distinct features of Banshee tradition is the belief that a Banshee is attached to certain families. Not everyone has a Banshee. Not every death is announced by her cry. The stories often suggest that particular lineages, especially old families with deep roots, might be followed by a Banshee who mourns their dead. That idea does something powerful. It makes the supernatural intimate. It turns a cosmic feared death into a family story. And when something becomes a family story, it lasts. It gets repeated at the table. It gets whispered after funerals. It gets mentioned when someone remembers an old relative who said, "I heard something the night before." Even if you don't believe in banshees, you can see how that belief would survive. Because it's not just a spooky tale, it's a way of saying, our family has a history. Our family has a shadow. Our family is connected to the land in a way outsiders don't understand. Now, what does a banshee look like? If you've seen modern movies, you probably imagine pale skin, sharp teeth, glowing eyes, and a scream that cracks glass. But the older folklore is far more varied, and honestly, more interesting. Some stories describe the banshee as a young woman with long hair, pale or silver, wearing a cloak. Others describe an old hag figure, wrinkled, small, hunched, like grief made physical. Sometimes she's dressed in gray, sometimes in white, sometimes in a dark cloak that blends into night. In some traditions, she's seen combing her hair. That detail appears often enough to become one of the banshee's famous motifs, the comb. You'll hear stories about a person finding a beautiful comb, taking it home, and later suffering bad luck, or hearing the banshee searching for it. These tales work like warnings. Don't steal from the otherworld. Don't treat strange objects like they're yours. Respect what doesn't belong to you. Another motif shows her washing. In related traditions, sometimes blended with banshee lore, you find the washerwoman at the ford, an omen figure seen washing clothes or shrouds near water, especially at night. In many cultures, water is a boundary. Rivers are crossing points, fords are thresholds. Seeing an otherworldly washer is like witnessing the preparation for death. Whether or not you classify that figure as a banshee, it lives in the same folklore neighborhood. Female omen, death warning, the otherworld stepping close. But again, if you want to understand why the banshee is so feared, focus less on her face and more on her voice. The banshee's cry is often described as keening, wailing, lamenting, a sound that doesn't feel like anger. It feels like sorrow. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Because anger you can fight, anger you can answer. Sorrow like that, you can't bargain with it. You can't reason with it, you can only endure it. And in the tradition, hearing the banshee isn't like being attacked. It's like being notified. It's the sound of inevitability. So how do people explain banshee encounters in folklore? Most of the classic accounts follow patterns rather than fixed stories. You'll hear about a traveler walking at night and hearing a cry that seems to come from the air itself. You'll hear about a family awake in a house when a strange wail moves past the windows, drifting like fog. You'll hear about someone seeing a figure near a wall, a tree line, or a hill, always slightly out of reach, always at the edge of certainty. And then, later, news arrives. Someone has died, or someone is dying. And the mind connects the events. That must have been the Banshee. That connection between a strange sound and a later tragedy is how omen stories survive. Humans are pattern makers. We link cause and effect. We remember unusual signs before big events. And when grief enters the picture, those memories become even sharper. But folklore is not only psychology, it's also culture. And the Banshee belongs to a culture that treated death as both personal and communal, something marked by ritual, by voice, by gatherings, by stories that offered meaning. So if you ask what the Banshee really is, you get two answers at once. In belief, she's an otherworldly woman, a spirit connected to the sea, who mourns before death and warns certain families. In symbolism, she's grief with a voice. Now here's where modern pop culture steps in and changes everything. Over time, especially through literature, film, and games, the Banshee gets transformed. The subtle mourning spirit becomes a screaming monster. The omen becomes the threat. The lament becomes a weapon. And in a way, you can understand why. Modern horror loves simple rules. This creature kills you. This monster hunts you. It's easier to sell a fear that has a clear attacker. But the old Banshee isn't an attacker. She's a messenger, and that difference matters. Because when you turn the Banshee into a monster, you erase the most uniquely Irish element of her story. The connection between mourning ritual and supernatural warning. You take a figure of lament, something tragically human, and replace it with a generic horror creature. So why do so many people still feel chills when they hear the word Banshee? Because the idea hits a primal nerve, a warning you can't use. Think about it. If someone told you something bad is about to happen, but didn't tell you how to stop it, that's terrifying. It creates helplessness, it creates suspense, it creates the feeling that fate is bigger than your choices. And that's exactly what Banshee stories do. They bring you to the doorstep of fate and let you listen to it coming. Now, let's talk about explanations. Without mocking the belief, without dismissing anyone's traditions. There are natural sounds that can be genuinely unsettling, especially at night. Wind moving through certain landscapes can create tones that sound almost like a voice. Animals can produce calls that feel shockingly human if you don't know what you're hearing. And distance plays tricks. A sound far away can feel like it's right beside you. Also, grief changes perception. When someone in a community is sick or elderly, people may already feel the approach of death. They may be watchful, sensitive, alert. In that emotional state, a strange sound can become charged with meaning. And then when death happens, memory does what memory always does. It locks onto the unusual moment and gives it significance. But here's the important part. Even if you fully accept every natural explanation, folklore still matters. Because folklore is not only about proving whether something exists like a scientific object. Folklore is about how people process reality. It's about meaning. It's about identity. It's about the stories we use to explain the hardest moments of life. The Banshee legend tells you that death is not just an ending, it's a passage. That the boundary between worlds may be thinner than we think. That grief is powerful enough to become a presence. That families carry histories the way the land carries footprints. And maybe that's why the Banshee endures. Not because everyone believes a supernatural woman is literally outside their window, but because everyone understands what it means to feel a warning in the air, to feel the hush before bad news, to feel that shift in reality where the world seems to pause, as if bracing for something. The Banshee is that feeling given a face, and more importantly, given a voice. So the next time you hear a Banshee story, don't flatten it into a cheap horror scream. Listen for the older layers beneath it. Listen for the mourning ritual, the sense of family. The landscape of mounds and hills that hold legends like they hold rain. The centuries of storytellers who kept repeating the same chilling idea. Sometimes the other world doesn't come to threaten you. Sometimes it comes to mourn. And if that's true, even as a symbol, then the Banshee isn't simply frightening. She's tragic. A spirit whose entire existence is a lament. A messenger of fate who never brings good news. A voice that arrives before the funeral, before the candles, before the prayers, crying as if the ending has already happened. Now I want to ask you something. If you heard that sound, if you heard keening in the distance on a night with no funeral, no gathering, no reason, what would you do? Would you follow it? Would you lock the door? Would you tell yourself it's just the wind? Or would a part of you, some older, quieter part, wonder if the stories were right all along? If you enjoyed this documentary and you want more Irish folklore deep dives, like the Dullahan, the Puka, the Morrigan, or the darker side of the fairies, tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment telling me, where are you watching from, and what's the creepiest piece of Irish folklore you've ever heard? Or the strangest sound you've ever heard at night that you still can't explain?